So welcome everyone to Living History, how municipalities can bring historic resources to life. My name is Rachel DeVos and I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the AUMA. I'll start today's webinar by providing a bit of context on AUMA's Land Use Planning webinar series and the connection between the land use framework and historic resources. I'll then turn things over to Larry Pearson, Director of Historic Places Stewardship for the Historic Resources Management Branch of Alberta Culture and Tourism, who will provide information on the opportunities and tools available to municipalities to preserve and protect locally significant historic resources. Next, Jennifer Kirchner, planner with the City of Lacombe, will share lessons learned by the city through implementing their award-winning Heritage Preservation Program. We'll have time for questions before wrapping things up with information on upcoming webinars and the Municipal Planning Hub AUMA will be developing over the next year. Today's webinar is part of AUMA's Land Use Planning series, which provides the opportunity for participants to learn more about and discuss the land use framework and related strategies. The series kicked off on September 30th with Pulling in the Same Direction, Aligning Land Use Decision Making, which provided an update on the status of regional plans under the framework, the requirements for municipal compliance with these plans, and an overview of the efficient use of land principles. And later on, I'll post a link to a recording of the webinar in the chat box, just if you didn't get the chance to take it in. Our second webinar, This Old Plan, Preserving Alberta's History Through Land Use Planning, provided an overview of the assistance that the Historic Resources Management Branch of Alberta Culture can provide to municipalities in identifying potential historic resources when developing area structure plans, and in meeting municipal obligations set out under the Historic Resources Act and the Land Use Framework. Historic resources may not be the first topic that comes to mind when one thinks of land use planning, as issues such as urban sprawl, energy development, and conservation of natural areas tend to get more attention. However, the management of historic resources is an important part of achieving the outcomes set out in the land use framework, namely a healthy economy supported by our land and natural resources, healthy ecosystems and environment, and people-friendly communities with ample recreational and cultural opportunities. Under this last outcome, the framework sets out that significant historic resources will be identified and protected, and potential impacts are managed effectively. Of course, the land use framework is being implemented through regional planning, and under the heading of Building Sustainable Communities, the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, or SSRP, includes an objective to ensure provincial guidance is provided to municipalities and stakeholders to foster preservation of historic resources through responsible land use management. The plan also sets out expectations of municipalities. And that's why last month's webinar focused on providing information on the regulatory aspect of the management of historic resources in connection with land use planning. And if you missed it, again, I'll post a link in the chat box. But today's webinar, we really wanted to balance information on the regulatory aspect with information on the tools available to help municipalities identify and designate important local heritage and the experience of a municipality in implementing those tools. So with that, and I know Larry and Jennifer have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to get right to it. So I'll introduce our first presenter, Larry Pearson, Director of Historic Places Stewardship for the Historic Resources Management Branch of Alberta Culture and Tourism. Larry has worked for Alberta Culture and Tourism for 36 years in a range of positions involving the development of Alberta's historic sites and the management of its heritage resources. Larry directs the province's programs dealing with the stewardship of our historic places. These include the Historic Places Research and Designation Program, the Heritage Conservation Advisory Services Program, and the Conservation and Construction Services Program. Larry is a graduate of Queen's University, where he obtained a BA Honours in Art History with a focus on architectural history. He has a Master's of Environmental Design and Architecture from the University of Calgary, where his area of specialization was architectural conservation. Following Larry will be Jennifer Kirchner, planner with the City of Lacombe. Through her position, Jennifer runs the city's Heritage Management Program, which includes the designation of heritage buildings, hosting heritage events, and running the Lacombe Heritage Facebook page. In her spare time, she is president of the Lacombe and District Historical Society, where she is a volunteer blacksmith. Jennifer is also finishing up her first year on the Alberta Historic Resources Foundation Board. So now I'll turn things over to Larry, and he'll be followed by Jennifer.
Okay, I've got my mic on, so I hope you can all hear me. I'm going to talk about how municipalities can conserve their local historic resources. My presentation is going to explore what we mean by heritage, what heritage conservation is. I'm going to say a few words about the framework nationally for heritage conservation, and then my primary focus is going to be the Alberta programs and how municipalities can use those to identify, protect, and preserve their historic resources. So what do we mean by heritage? Heritage is a fairly broad term. From our perspective in the Heritage Resources Management branch, we're primarily interested in historic places. Within the Heritage Division, obviously, we look at museums and archives, but the focus of today's talk will be on historic places, which can be defined as structures, buildings, groups of buildings, districts, or landscapes and archaeological sites that we want to recognize for their heritage value. So, what do we mean by heritage conservation? Heritage conservation has sort of three components to its meaning. We can preserve historic places, we can restore historic places, and we can rehabilitate historic places. So what do these things mean? Preservation essentially is actions or processes that are directed at protecting, maintaining, or stabilizing an existing historic place, so keeping it the way it is. Restoration, on the other hand, is used most appropriately where you're dealing with fairly significant historic sites, where you wish to return them to the appearance that they had at a very specific point in time. So we restore the Minchner House to when Roland Minchner lived there, which was, I think, in Lacombe, was not very long. That's the house he was born in. A good example of restored historic places would be the buildings at the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village east of Edmonton. The last type of activity that falls under the general umbrella of historic conservation is rehabilitation. And that's the process of accurately the process of making possible a continued or compatible use, contemporary use for an historic building. The example here, which is sort of at the bottom of the slide, is the old Wetaskiwin Courthouse, which has been extended and developed to be the City of Wetaskiwin City Hall. When we look at how we deal with historic places, we have a general process here that essentially looks at three steps. First of all, we have to know what they are, so identification is important. And we do that through a series of tools, surveys, inventories, community awareness programs. And once we've decided what's important, and I'll go into each of these in more detail as I move through my presentation, then we seek to protect them. The province does this through designation as provincial historic resources, and municipalities are empowered to do this as municipal historic resources. And lastly, once protected, we manage them. And that's essentially, we monitor alterations to them, and we ensure that they're being maintained, and that any alterations to them are appropriate and don't diminish their heritage values. So heritage conservation in Canada, what does this look like? The country first got really involved in historic resource management with the establishment of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada in 1919. The government, in fact, has designated the number of historic sites in Alberta. a number of National Historic Sites. I think there's about 60 of them, and the first were designated in the 1920s and included, for example, the Frog Lake site and Fort McLeod, the original site of Fort McLeod in Fort McLeod. Federal government also protects historic resources that are outside the jurisdiction of provinces, and those would include things that are on the land owned by any federally regulated company like railways. So Alberta and municipalities within Alberta are unable to deal with railway stations that are on federally regulated land, and unfortunately other structures which can often be grain elevators. There's a Heritage Lighthouse program run by Parks Canada, and I believe Alberta is the only province or territory that has no federally managed lighthouses. Saskatchewan has one up on Lake Athabasca. There are 167 historic sites in Canada that Parks Canada operates, and there are over 950 places that are recognized by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. Again, 60 of those are in Alberta. The federal government, working with the provinces and territories, has developed a program called the Historic Places Program. The website is there, and you'll be able to access this afterwards when you download the recording of this webinar. And one of the principal tools that the Historic Places Collaboration developed was a set of standards and guidelines that articulate proper treatment of historic resources. What are the preferred or recommended actions so that when you modify an historic place, you can be assured that you're maintaining its heritage value. All of the provinces and territories in Canada have signed on to this pan-Canadian system. Heritage conservation in Alberta is empowered by the Historical Resources Act. Historic resources are defined as any work of nature or of humans that is primarily of value for its paleontological, archaeological, prehistoric, historic, cultural, natural, scientific, and aesthetic interest, including but not limited to paleontological, archaeological, prehistoric, historic, or natural sites, structures, or objects. So that's the breadth of stuff that the Act allows the province and municipal governments to protect. The Act has a number of different levels of designation or protection. Provincial historic resources, and there's about 380 of those now. Provincial historic areas, there are two, Old Strathcona in Edmonton and the downtown of the town of Fort McLeod are the two provincial historic areas. Registered historic resources, which are really not protected, there's a 90-day protection afforded to those. Municipal historic resources and municipal historic areas. We have some online resources. The Alberta Register of Historic Places is the official list of all protected places, and this has municipal designated sites listed on it. As far as we are aware of their existence. There's no requirement in the Act that says municipalities have to tell the province that they have designated places, but in order to get funding from the Alberta Historical Resources Foundation, you need to be listed on this register. So that's a good reason to tell us that you've designated something. In addition to receiving the actual designation bylaw from you, we also need a statement of significance, and that will become clear to you in a few minutes as to what that means. So what kind of tools do we have to support municipal heritage conservation? Here's a range of things that have been, this picture is a good sort of cross-section of municipally significant sites. The black and white photo is a photo of Sexsmith, taken probably in the 1960s. I'm not sure what all of these things are. The Canmore Hotel is on the left, and the next building in is a very interesting straw bale church in the county of Grand Prairie. So we have tools that help municipalities identify. The Act allows them to protect, and the Historic Resources Foundation has financial assistance to help the owners of historic places that municipalities protect and conserve them. So councils are empowered under the Historic Resources Act to designate individual properties as municipal historic resources and areas as municipal historic areas. Once protected, then council has the ability to allow or refuse permission to alter or demolish these protected properties. The Act clearly says that you need mayor and council's permission or their delegates' permission, usually a heritage planner in larger communities, before you can do any work on a municipally protected historic place. Municipalities may provide grants, loans, or other incentives. There are a number of very interesting programs in Alberta. Calgary and Edmonton probably have the most robust programs, but the town of Banff, for example, has a grant program. Sometimes the incentives that are provided are in terms of tax rebates or tax concessions that extend over a longer period of time. In other cases, they're out-and-out grants or zoning concessions. Relaxations of setbacks or enhancements of coverage on the sites where the historic building is. And these are provided as an incentive for the owner to agree to protection of the site. Municipalities also may establish heritage advisory boards, and we highly recommend this. Heritage advisory boards, what we refer to as HABs, are developed to advise council on heritage issues. They oversee the implementation of a municipality's heritage initiatives. They facilitate community awareness, and they play a role in the identification and evaluation of possible historic places. And in many instances, they also provide comment to the mayor and council as to what alterations should or should not be allowed. So they have a design review role. We have developed a series of manuals that are available online that take you through, as a municipality, the process of identifying, evaluating, and managing locally significant historic places. The first set of manuals deals with how you can carry out a survey. The survey essentially looks at all of the places that are of a certain age or older, usually 40 years old or older. So this is old stuff, not necessarily important. The second manual is one that deals with how you evaluate an historic place, how you evaluate old stuff to determine whether it's important old stuff. And lastly, a manual on how to develop management programs, incentive programs, and what role the municipality plays after it's protected a place to ensure that those places retain their heritage values. All right. So this is a graph we often use, our little Venn diagram, that shows you how these bits fit together. The largest circle is what you capture in a heritage survey. So those are all the places that are 40 years old or older. From that, you develop what we often refer to as a POIL, or a Places of Interest list. That's a subset of that old stuff, 40-year-old or older stuff, that in fact has a high likelihood of being important. Usually a municipality moves to undertaking what we refer to as an inventory, which is an analysis of that POIL list to actually put together a list of stuff that in fact is significant and is probably important enough to merit the municipality protecting under municipal designation. The province, for a number of years, had grant assistance to support municipalities through a program that no longer exists called the Municipal Heritage Partnership Program. However, the Alberta Historic Resources Foundation will look at grant applications under their research category for survey or inventory work. Right now, we have, okay. Now, before I get into that, so the first issue is deals with heritage surveys, and these are essentially activities that gather baseline information on everything that's 40 years old or older. The province has been maintaining its own province-wide survey, which you can access online, and we have, I think, about 120,000 sites that are included in that. Percentage of these will no longer be extant, will have been demolished, but this gives us a very clear understanding of what historic buildings existed in Alberta from the time we started doing the survey. It's very helpful in answering questions, for example, such as, is this a now rare example of a once common type? The survey allows us to decide whether, in fact, there were a lot of these things in the past. Survey work usually includes, looks at buildings that are 40 years old or older. It involves archival work, and it involves capturing archival quality photographs of this condition of the structure at the time the survey is being done, and tries to establish baseline information like name of architect or builder, date of construction for the resource, details how the property may have changed over time, lists owners and uses over time, both current and historic, and provides a legal description and an address for the individual property. And as I say, we have that kind of information for well over 100,000 resources in the province. The inventory phase of managing historic resources looks at which one of these survey buildings in fact is significant. So it asks questions that around significance and a notion we call integrity. So the first step of undertaking an inventory is to assess whether a site is eligible or not. There are certain things that municipalities, for example, can't designate, and those would be properties owned by the federal government and owned by the provincial government, and obviously anything that's outside your municipal jurisdiction, i.e. in the county, outside your city boundaries. We also exclude a series of types of resources. We don't list buildings that have been moved or relocated to museum villages. Our point is to preserve historic places in situ on their original locations. We consider that there's a loss of value when we remove structures from the place where they were built. We don't designate small objects, we don't designate reconstructions, and we don't designate human remains. We ask questions about cemeteries before we designate them. Cemeteries in and of themselves would not be considered historic. They'd have to meet other tests. They'd have to reflect, for example, a major event. An example of a designated cemetery of that nature is the one associated with the Hillcrest mine disaster. Generally, we don't designate birthplaces or graves of important people. We'd rather see a structure where they had most of their productive life protected rather than their gravesite, for example. We don't protect or designate resources that are primarily commemorative in nature, cairns, for example. Although important ceremonial places like cenotaphs would be considered. And lastly, any resource that's been moved from its original site would be outside the list of things we'd consider eligible for designation. So we'll move now to ask the question about what we see as our significance criteria. So historic places in Alberta can be significant for any one of these 5 criteria. They can be clearly associated with an important theme in our history, activity, cultural practice, or an event that has made a significant contribution to our past. They can be associated with important people or institutions. In both of these criteria A and B, we ask the question, how important was the event or person or institution, and how strong was the association? We designate buildings because they're examples of a particular design or style or method of construction. The very rare Hay Bale Church in Grand Prairie County being an example of that. It's an interesting building in Saskatchewan that's a sod house, an old soddy that's on the Canadian Register of Historic Places. Gives you an example of sort of material usage that's important. We protect places for their information potential. This is usually used for archaeological resources, and the province is usually involved in designating those. And lastly, we can designate places for their landmark or symbolic value. I'm going to say a few words now about a document that we call a Statement of Significance. When you're going through the process of evaluating sites, and this is all laid out in the evaluation manual, one of the tools you develop is a statement of why you find that place to be significant. And this statement of significance has three parts. It contains a description of the place. It contains an articulation of why the place is of value. And lastly, it lists or exemplifies features of the place that are essential to articulating or exemplifying its heritage value. These attributes or physical features are called character-defining elements. If you look on the Alberta Register of Historic Places, you'll find for every site that's listed there, there is the statement of significance for that site. This is a very important tool in how we manage sites. This is a key to any developer or owner, future owner, as to what elements of that place need to be preserved or retained in any intervention or alteration that's made to the structure. So essentially, as I've said, it's to explain why the place is valued and to raise awareness of its importance. And when designated, to identify those things about the place that must be protected and conserved. And from that sense, it's used as the foundation for your processes for evaluating any proposed changes to the historic place. In Alberta, we have 2,685, and this was at the end of March 2015, we had 2,685 places that municipalities had inventoried and written statements of significance for. That number is probably because we have some ongoing inventory projects that municipalities are undertaking. City of Lloydminster, for example, is doing one. City of Lethbridge is adding to their inventory. So we may have 2,800 places that merit protection. And I guess one way of looking at how successful we're all being is to see whether our list of protected places is precisely the same as our list of significant places. That would be our objective, is to protect all of those significant places. The final manual that we have developed that you can find access to deals with the management of historic resources. For example, it will explore the conditions under which you might designate places. It lays out what is expected of owners of designated places. It will articulate the role of council and the municipality in terms of how they use their inventory and how they review changes or alterations that are proposed to historic places. This application and alteration review process, for example, and often the management plans that municipalities develop articulate clearly the kinds of incentives that municipalities can provide. The Historic Resources Act requires municipalities to compensate owners for loss of economic value for historic places that they designated. So in virtually every instance, in fact in every instance where a municipal government has protected a site, they have provided incentives to owners or the owner has said, I just want to protect my resource, and has waived their right to compensation. I think Jennifer will say a bit more about this from a municipal perspective. One of the incentives that municipal designation provides is access to Alberta Historic Resources Foundation funding. Currently, which is how we refer to the Alberta Historic Resources Foundation, provides 50% matching grants to a maximum of $50,000 for work that's eligible, i.e. that meets the standards and guidelines. So there's a fairly rich incentive there for a certain scale of building. These grants are annual allocations, so an owner could develop a conservation program that spanned 4 or 5 years and access grants over each of those years to support his work. And again, they're 50-50 matching grants generally. Here's a range of interesting municipal resources that have been protected. The DU Ranch Lands Cabin, I think, is the one on the upper left. This is protected by the MD of Pincher Creek. and it was their first municipal designation. On the right is the so-called Trapper Shack in Fort Vermilion, an old fur trading post. Fort Vermilion is one of the oldest communities in Alberta, dating from fur trade posts that are from the late 1700s. The little school is Roland School near Concert, protected by Special Area Number 4. The impressive home in the middle is Annandale residence in Lethbridge. It's both a municipal and a provincial historic resource. And New Brigden protected their railway water tower, which is the one on the right. You can see the growth in our number of historic, municipally protected historic sites. In 2004, when we actually developed our program to engage municipalities, we had 68 is the number you can't read there, just outside the screen, protected resources. And currently in 2015, we sit at 282 municipal historic resources. Again, this is just to reiterate the funding that's available. Municipal historic resources designated by Council by a bylaw are eligible for up to $50,000 in matching funds to support approved conservation work. The Foundation has 2 deadlines, September 1st and February 1st, where you can make applications. I guess I thought I had a slide here that had Karina Naranhila's name. That was before. Okay, you will find in the presentation Karina Naranhila's name. She's the grant coordinator for these grants. And you'll also find that we have conservation advisors who can help you, who actually review the grants and will talk to the owners of historic places in your municipalities about what they can and cannot do or shouldn't do to their protected resources. So the last thing I'd like you to do is to, all of you, if you haven't done so already, is to sign up to receive our retroactive blog, which is available at www.albertashistoricplaces.ca. We try to blog a couple of times a week, and this provides interesting information about historic places and information about our programs and services. Anyway, that's my contribution to today's discussions. I'll be able to answer questions at the end, I think, is how we're doing it. Jennifer?
Thank you, Larry. I hope everyone can hear me. Just type away if you can't. So I am going to talk about the Lacombe context, so how Lacombe has built our program and provide it as an example that other municipalities can utilize. Lacombe's program has been recognized by the Alberta Professional Planners Institute as a plan that can be utilized by other communities as an example of heritage preservation, and it was also actually recognized by the ARF Foundation a few years back for municipal preservation. So the plan itself we're very proud of having been built from start to finish. So before I get into too much details, one of the biggest rules for developing a plan, and this could be any plan, is engaging the public. For something such as heritage preservation, heritage buildings can be very emotional for people. People tend to have some sort of tie to them, whether it's a memory of going there as a child, going to the business and getting candy, going to the movie theater and seeing a movie, those types of things. So people tend to be very sensitive and somewhat emotional when discussing the preservation of buildings or the loss of buildings. So engaging the public is crucial to making sure that the plan will actually work. You want to break down those barriers between the public and those who are building the plan. Removing misconceptions is also important. When you're going through this type of process, you'll quickly learn what people think preservation means and what designation means. For a lot of people, they think it means that the building cannot be altered in any way. So that means you can't add a bathroom, you can't add a kitchen, you can't add electricity or plumbing. And those are truly misconceptions. A building can be updated to meet modern needs so that the building is still able able to be utilized. And we want to make sure that people know that if they choose to designate or go down that path, that there are still opportunities to upgrade the building, to build an addition, to make sure that that building continues to be functional going forward, and to be able to be utilized in a way that engages the public. We also want to build trust between the public and the group that is leading this process. We want to know them to know that they can come to us with ideas or issues that they think should be dealt with throughout the process. So public engagement is vital for this type of process to succeed. Communication as well, just making sure that you have those ideas and events out in public so that they know what's going on. With Lacombe's process, utilizing newspaper and radio for traditional advertisement, featured articles, things like that, but also utilizing some of the social media sites. Twitter is a great way to get things out to local media and get them picking up on potential stories or events for them. Facebook is really great to send information to the regular public, remind them with some last-minute things about an event you're hosting. And the blog is great for longer, more detailed articles, and those can obviously be interconnected and provide a great way for successes to be promoted to the community. And this could be everything from winning an award or getting a grant, or simply a kudos. We have one there from Alberta Historic Places. Thank you for helping to preserve and promote our built heritage. You rock. Something as simple like that can really put a community on a positive momentum and really lift people's spirits when it comes to heritage preservation. The committee a committee was formed for this process. We had a Heritage Steering Committee. It included a councillor, representative from our local historical society, members from the public, and city staff members who supported it. This group was actually adopted as an official group by council once we completed our heritage management plan. So they were formalized through bylaw process. The members are appointed by a city council, and they were renamed the Heritage Resources Committee. So they are council's representative for heritage issues. They make the recommendation for designating buildings. They are able to award grant funding, and they undertake in different projects in order to promote heritage preservation to the public. So that aspect is a great way to merge the administration or city side with members of the public who are interested in heritage preservation and can have those dialogues with their fellow citizens. So Lacombe's process for building our heritage program very much follows what Larry talked about with the different steps. Other communities have undertaken things in different orders, and it's completely up to them what process would work best for them. But we started with the initial survey. So we surveyed 255 sites in the community, and we used 50 years of age or older as our benchmark age. And then we whittled that list down to 109, and that is what comprises of our POIL list, Places of Interest list. So we do have a little map there that shows places of interest, all sites considered and updated, just of our downtown core. These documents, all the documents I'll talk about, are available on our website, so you can take a look and see how we laid this out for people to be easily accessible for residents. And this document is commonly used for our initial research when we have demolition applications being submitted. We take a look and sometimes use this as a way of determining if a building is 50 years or older before we go digging any further if we aren't sure. After that, we started our municipal heritage inventory. So we documented 55 sites and structures with statements of significance. Now, this does not mean that the other buildings from our inventory necessarily lack the value to be designated. These sites were agreed upon by the property owners to have a statement of significance completed. So these buildings just happen to have that extra level of documentation that would make designation slightly easier. If a building on the survey list, the POIL list, wishes to proceed with that, it just means that there will be extra steps that will need to take place before we're ready to actually prepare a designation bylaw. The SOSs, as Larry pointed out, includes things such as the history of the building, and this might include any known additions or major renovations that have been done. It describes the architectural style, and it lists those character-defining elements, those basically no-go pieces of the building, things that if they were destroyed, most likely the heritage value would be lost. So we have very diverse statements of significance, from a commercial building such as the Day Block to the Watt residence, which is a very simple-looking middle-class home and is actually one of several that have the exact same look, and they were all designed by Mr. Abel. And then the Trimble residence, which is a much more grander, larger scale home that was owned by a wealthier family to the community. Apparently it was their weekend home. They lived in Calgary originally and came up on the weekend. So there's some diversity. There's also our cemetery, our cenotaph, things like that that have been included as well. Once we'd completed that, that's when we moved forward with preparing the actual heritage management plan. This document is not as exciting as some of the others. You don't get to look at lovely pictures of architecture and really discuss the story of a building. But this document is crucial for administrators who are in charge of actually implementing heritage preservation in a community, because it creates that framework for how you're going to preserve buildings, how you're going to manage them, and how you're going to promote or celebrate your successes. So ours set forward the process on designating buildings. It outlined the incentive options. So we had looked at a variety of options, but had decided that a grant program, a plaque program, those would be some of the best ways to provide incentives for residents who wish to proceed with designation. And we also outlined our goals and action items for the heritage program in the community, and this included creating a more extensive demolition assessment process for all buildings aged 50 and older. We launched our incentive program, our grant program, and the plaque program. We developed a Doors Open event to promote heritage buildings and make them more accessible to the public. And we also tied heritage into city beautification and streetscaping. So throughout this process, we utilized a few tactics to get the public involved. Open houses are very traditional, advertised in the newspaper. We sent personal invitations to all property owners who had an SOS created, and we actually followed up with phone calls a week before the event. That brought a lot more people out. They really liked that personal touch. Not all communities can do that based on staffing levels, but that worked well for us. And we also hosted in a heritage location. So this is in St. Andrew's United Church. We held workshops and interviews, and these were used particularly for developing incentives in the program structure. So for the residents and institutional property owners, we hosted a workshop for them to discuss what they think would be a great way to promote designation for them. We intended to have the similar setup for commercial property owners, but it's Alberta, poor weather happened, and we ended up doing one-on-one interviews with them to decide how they think incentives should be shaped for best benefit for them. We also liked to get in touch with our senior population. They often remember or know things about the heritage buildings in the community that were never recorded. They meet every morning at the A&W and have coffee, so we were invited there to sit and chat. And the Cozy Corner, which was the seniors community center, we went and talked to them. Some of them remembered people who had lived there or details. Others were just simply happy to have a copy of those statements of significance, and they got to look at these houses, and they remembered going there as a kid and having punch or having a little New Year's Eve party. So for them, it really connected to them, to their past, and also built that trust that they knew that younger generations were valuing things that they value themselves. Implementation is definitely crucial. You can build all this stuff, but if you do not implement it, then people will lose trust in you. They'll think that it's just another plan or document that you prepared and is now going to sit and get dusty on a shelf. Our Lacombe Heritage Facebook page is probably our best way to get in touch with people. I do weekly posts on the page. Often we'll do posts on houses. This little house there, very charming, very modest, was rumored to have a hidden entrance into the floor where Granny would sit on top and prevent the revenuers from finding the illegal liquor. Whether that's true or not, who knows, but it is a really fascinating story, and over 1,700 people actually read that little story and shared their information. We also share photos from the Lacombe and District Historical Society's archives. So these include a picture of the streetscape of Lacombe, and that charming gentleman with his dog is Mr. Puffer, who was a member of the Legislative Assembly, and he's definitely, for some of us, one of our favorite guys. Just a fun name, and he was himself a very amazing man who assisted his colleague, who is a Chinese immigrant, in bringing his wife and daughter over, and actually was a business partner with him. They co-owned a building. So some of those fun stories really promote to people a little bit more information about our local heritage and get them a bit more excited. We also promote heritage events so that people know what is going on. These include events by our Historical Society, city heritage events such as our designation celebrations, Doors Open, and our Greatest Places in Canada Win, which was one for our 50th Avenue, aka our historic Main Street, and other events such as the Heritage School Fair that occurred. We also share interesting posts made by other municipalities, province, and the heritage, federal heritage groups, just so that people have a bit more connection to the broader scope. Doors Open Lacombe has been one of the ways that we have promoted heritage, allowing people to tour buildings. This year we actually did a guided tour of our local cemetery, which is very interesting. We had visitors from across the province, including Mike from Canmore. So we had some diversity there. The committee also undertook a Doors of Lacombe poster project to promote heritage to a broader audience. 13 property owners agreed to participate, and the money raised from this will go into our heritage grant program, which will be used ongoing to build for heritage grants for preservation work. We've started up a salvage program, so we are now either recommending salvage of items, or if we have permission from property owners, taking items before they're demolished. And we're looking to sell these to people who are interested, and that money will also go into our grant fund. The Heritage Management Plan and designation. So one of the key things I insisted on having in our management plan was examples of application forms. It gives us a basis for moving forward. The last thing you want is someone coming up to you and saying, I want to designate, and you don't have anything prepared. And these documents, we've started using them, and they don't end up working the way we want. We always tweak them, but it provides a good foundation for moving forward. So we have the actual application to designate, heritage inventory evaluation form, a designation bylaw, and a heritage alteration permit application, and we use those kind of as a basis so that we're not completely blown away with the first one and completely lost. Our first municipal designation occurred last year, and it was St. Andrew's United Church. They approached us fairly early on when we were just starting our management plan to let us know their interest, and we'd been working with them throughout, so they were our very first designation. And it's a very beautiful red brick church in our community. We had a celebration event, which was very popular during one of their church services, and a plaque, the first of our plaque program, was installed. It was a very, very positive event and a very important community location, they host concerts and things that are not actually tied to their congregation. And our second building that we designated is our local blacksmith shop. It is already a provincially designated building, but the Historical Society wanted to move forward and promote how the blacksmith shop is actually important to the community and how Lacombe had developed from, a small village into the city that it is. So yet again, this fall we had our designation events. We had some pretty good coverage. The blacksmith shop is a very popular community location, a very interactive museum, and that was a very lovely event during our Culture and Harvest weekend. So going forward, we want to continue to connect the public and building owners and make sure that they are aware of this program and what it can provide for them. We want to grow doors open and support other local heritage events that people are inundated with heritage in their community and they can have a better appreciation for it. And we are, like many communities, attempting to approach residential buildings for designation, and that tends to be one of the bigger challenges, is getting residential buildings to designate. Commercial buildings seem to be the easiest sell, and I'm sure we're not alone in hoping that we'll get our first one, and that might break down those barriers and get other property owners interested in preserving some of their beautiful homes. Lacombe is very lucky to have such a great collection of these. So I think now we'll just turn it over to questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jennifer. It was great to share your experience, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call will find that, on the webinar will find that really valuable. Now we do have quite a few questions to get to, and do feel free to, if you're on the webinar and have further questions, to enter them in. If we happen to run out of time to get to all of them, first of all, we can keep interview, and if you have to sign off, we can keep going and you can come back and watch the recording, and we can also, if we have a lot, do some via email after. So the first question is for Larry. How do the Alberta Building and Fire Codes treat historic buildings? Does a building code officer have the qualifications to assess the safety of the building, or does the ABC treat these buildings specifically? How many inspections are mandatory, and when during construction? Any practical knowledge on that?
I'm being told to turn my mic on here. The Historic Resources Act does have a clause in it that empowers the minister to waive requirements of the code. This is not done very often. In fact, I'm not sure we've ever done it. The Alberta Building Code allows for equivalencies, and our sense is that that is a sufficient tool to ensure that the building can remain safe and its heritage values can be retained. So there's no specific aspect to the code or for building codes officers that I think it's up to them to have the skills that allow them to, or both the skills and the confidence to be able to say, yes, that's an equivalent condition. In some situations you find the building codes officer wanting to follow strictly what the code says, and that of course really doesn't stand up to this notion of equivalent propositions or ways of ensuring safe conditions are maintained. Historic buildings don't want to be unsafe. I don't think we ever want to be in a situation where we've allowed something to happen in terms of code issues that makes the building less safe than it should have been. But I think one of the big issues is trying to develop learning or examples of equivalent treatments for building code officials to allow them to understand how structures can be altered in ways, or how historic aspects of structures can be retained and altered in ways that make sure the buildings are still safe. I hope that answers your question. I'm just going to go down, scroll down a little bit more to see what else you're asking. There's no requirement to inspect buildings from historic buildings any more than there is from any other building. So historic buildings aren't treated separately. There's no mandatory inspection. Obviously, when buildings are being altered or work's being done, then the code officials would come in and occupancy permits would be issued. But there's no special treatment in that respect.
So Larry, her second part of her question is, are properties in the green area of the province, or how are properties in the green area of the province treated? How would a municipality determine if it's theirs or if it's the province's resource in terms of being on that crown land? I think that's what.
If